Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video, we're back with another video about Survivor 49, this being my mid-season power ranking, a tradition I do every season, and this is going to be a bit of a weird one, where I might as well preface this from the very beginning here. I am spoiled on Survivor 49. I do know the final three, I do know the assumed winner. I also did know the pre-jury and the post-jury, though again that seems irrelevant at this point, but again, I am spoiled in this season, and through that, again, that should be this massive disclaimer on this video. Again, this video will not be a spoiler video. To give a full breakdown of what this video is going to be, again, like my other preseason power rankings, I will give my opinions on the season so far, along with my opinion on the eliminated players, and I will say if you are spoiler adverse, that part of the video should still be perfectly fine. Also, once we get to the actual power ranking itself, I did do a lot of debating on whether or not I should even do a power ranking, or if I should just be running through each player. I still decided at the end to still do a power ranking. However, I will attempt to stay as unbiased as possible and simply just do it based on what I'm seeing from the edit. Though, obviously, again, if you want to avoid spoilers of any kind, I would advise against watching the actual power ranking itself, as I do feel like, again, there could be biases in play that could be affecting the ranking. And let's get started off with just my general thoughts on the season. Again, no spoilers involved. What do I think of this season? It's not good so far, and genuinely, I feel like this season has just been very frustrating in a sense that it's not even like actively bad, it's just so mid that it just elicits no reaction. It's a season that just felt like nothing notable was really happening for a good chunk of it. Where outside of the Jake elimination, us getting 2 tribes, it didn't really feel like anything new was really happening here. We were still getting 3 tribes of 6 on the offset. We were still getting the same sort of dynamics in play on those tribes, and there being like one disaster tribe. After the swap even, we got it playing out in pretty much the worst possible scenario where both sides have a clear majority and they're clearly going to stick with that majority. Where, again, everything about this season just has played out so poorly, which is really underwhelming, especially when I don't feel like this season's really been providing that much from a character perspective either. Now, it has more recently. I will say this last episode was, again, probably the best of the season. I do think this Sage-Shannon dynamic has really been the highlight of this pre-merge. It's pretty much been like the only thing about this pre-merge that has been good. To where while I do like someone like a Sophie B as a character, and I do like the way that like Nate talks about the game, and I mean, there's like individual people that are fine, and again, I think this is a fine cast on paper. I just feel like in execution here, we really haven't been getting the greatest content from this season, which is a shame considering, again, I thought this was a fun cast from the preseason. I thought they had some fun interviews, and again, I don't fault this on the cast themselves. I just feel like the way the season's been playing out so far has just been in a rather uninteresting way. So I have been very frustrated with how these episodes have been portrayed. A lot of it just feels like the same content over and over and over again, the same reoccurring storylines, the same content about Savannah and Jawan, the same content about Sophie and Sage, where while, again, it's fun content, it's still just the same repetitive stuff over and over again, where it really feels like the season's been really lacking in content. I do think they've been struggling to find content for the show, whereas it really feels like a season that is actually being harmed by the fact that it's 90 minutes. I think it actually would have been helped from shorter episodes here to not make the content as derivative, where I know Jeff himself has said that the season gets crazy towards the end, where hopefully he's right. Now, again, it's Jeff, so who knows with like half the things he says. But again, even he seemed to acknowledge the fact that the season does start off pretty slow, to where I'm assuming at least something good must happen by the end, where, again, hopefully we get to that. But so far, again, I do feel like the season has been extremely rough, where I think this is quite possibly one of the worst pre-merges in Survivor history. Really, if it was not for the culmination of the Sage-Shannon dynamic, I would say it's definitely the worst, where I really feel like episode 6 like might have been able to, again, scratch it out of that position. But even then, again, this is just a pretty brutal start to the season that hopefully gets better. But again, with that, now let's talk about the eliminated players so far, brief opinions on them, which again, still will not involve any spoilers. But again, starting it off with Nicole. And Nicole's someone I was disappointed to lose so early. I did feel like Nicole had a fun energy that was disappointing to see leave after only episode 1, though. Again, she did have some great moments. Again, her puking, I guess, and her spitting in Jeremiah's face, which is an insane visual, though. Really outside that, obviously didn't really get that much to do, and as a player, again, also didn't really feel like she had that much of an opportunity considering how she was perceived. But again, at least got a couple notable moments out of her premiere. Next, I'm moving on to Annie. And Annie's someone that, well, again, seemed like a terrible player, was a bit delusional about her position in the game. Outside that, really didn't provide too much to me. I do feel like Annie's someone that sadly might end up being like one of the more forgettable Survivor players of all time down the road, where this is just not a particularly notable run from her, where at least Nicole will have like the first boot of it all. We'll have getting in Jeremiah's face, where Annie, I just don't think really did anything particularly unique on this season to come off as that notable in the grand scheme of things. And also, it's just kind of frustrating how obvious her elimination was, to where, again, I really did not get that much out of her. Next, I'm moving on to Jake. And obviously, of these early boots, I think Jake is the most likely person we're going to see play again. Obviously, getting medevac from the game in this very dramatic way, to where if Jake is not at least in the running for the next fraternity season, I would be kind of surprised. Yeah, I don't love Jake on the show. I mean, he was fine. Again, someone that was playing a solid game up until the point he was eliminated, though really outside that, I do feel like he, again, had some awkward moments on the show. Also, his like shoe bandit stuff really didn't hit for me. So I do sympathize with his backstory and also how he ends up leaving the game. I do feel like he's someone that I don't need to see play again. Yeah, again, I'm kind of expecting it. And then we move on to Jeremiah, who's someone that I am surprised didn't end up becoming a bigger character on the show, as again, he's someone that did get a lot of focus in the initial trailer, to where while I was spoiled that he was an early boot, I was surprised to see him be just kind of an afterthought on the show itself, where actually of his alliance, it felt like he was like the most under-edited of the bunch, where obviously Sophie, Alex, and Jake got bigger edits than him. And beyond that, again, I didn't really feel like there was that much care put into his edit, which I think is disappointing, considering, again, it seems like he's a really fun character. Like, I really felt like he could potentially be this like next coming of Jam Jam, though we really didn't get much of that, and I think that's a bit of a shame. And he kind of gets screwed out of the game as well. Not entirely, as Ozzy was still at least a vote. Though again, with the idol in play and Jake getting medevac, again, who really knows what would have happened if those things didn't happen, where I think Jeremiah just gets a fairly unlucky run on this season, both from a player perspective and also from how he ended up being edited on the show, to where despite being a massive presence, it felt like he was just kind of an afterthought in the edit. But then we move on to Matt. And Matt is someone that I was a little underwhelmed on the show with. Like, I felt like he was someone that in the preseason felt like he was going to be a big character. While I didn't know how well it would go for him, I at least, like, talked a big game. And on the show, he was just kind of there. Again, had an alliance on his initial tribe at least, but really outside that, just gets swapped, screwed, and gets taken out. Sure, realistically, I mean, there's not that much to really say about him, especially considering Hina as a whole just was severely under-edited. There really did not get that much of him until his elimination. That was the spot where he just seemed kind of screwed from the offset. And again, to be fair, like, I do think him obviously, like, trying to flip the vote on Nate maybe wasn't the most well-advised move, though at the same time, like, I at least respect him for having the gusto to try in that spot. But again, as a whole, just another one that will probably be largely forgotten about over time, as he didn't have a particularly notable run here. And we then move on to Jason, who is kind of the same thing, where Jason also someone that we didn't really get to know that much about. Again, he was an alternate. We knew that. We knew he likes Pokemon, so that's something. But really outside that, again, like, it doesn't feel like Jason is someone that really had that important of an edit here. Despite the fact that, again, I thought he was going to, especially at the point where, like, we got, like, his story about being an alternate on the starting mat, where I very much assumed that that would lead to him being at least someone that got a better edit than what he did. But again, he just ends up being another casualty of, again, just like Hina not really getting that much content. We really didn't know where he was in the game from the edit, to where we've heard, like, post-show stuff that he, again, had an alliance with, like, Steven, MC, and Sophie S, but again, that wasn't on the show. And again, because that, it just ends up being this kind of weird thing with Jason here, where, and we really just did not know much about his position in the game until he was swap screwed. And again, he seems like a really nice guy, but just someone that, again, didn't really provide too much entertainment for the show either. And finally, we're moving on to Shannon. And really, of the early boots here, I think Shannon is by far the best character of the bunch. I mean, a kind of insane figure, one that says ridiculous things, someone that obviously ended up being a major source of drama on this season. Is probably the person of this crop that I would be the most inclined to want to see play again, considering how insane of a figure she seems to be. Though as a player, I think she's a bit of a weird one, where it did seem like she had some decent traction on her original tribe, though once she swapped, it did seem like people just weren't buying her shtick for much longer, and she eventually goes home in a spot where she should have a majority, to where I think she is a kind of high variance player here, to where I think it very much is dependent on the types of people around her, which, I mean, to be fair, is everybody. But I mean, like, this is a spot where I think there are certain people that will see through what Shannon is doing and not believe a single second of it, while there's others that will buy into it and want to work with her. And I feel like there is that level of high variance there of Shannon, to where she could either be extremely effective or extremely ineffective. And I think that kind of makes her an interesting player here, though. Also an interesting character for the show, especially with, again, her kind of one-sided rivalry with Sage. And again, all that was fun content to where, while I wouldn't necessarily like Shannon if I was on the island with her and I would be very much into Sage mold, I did feel like she brought a lot of entertainment for a show and is, again, by far the best character of the players booted so far. But with that, now we're getting to the players left in the game. We're at the final 11, where, again, at this point, I will preface this with the fact that, again, I will still attempt to make this power ranking unbiased, unspoiled. And again, I will not be directly talking about any spoilers here. Yeah, again, if you are extremely averse to want to be spoiled in anything, I would advise you to stop watching this video at this point, though. Say there will be Survivor 50 casting spoilers about this portion of the video where I will talk about the 2 returnees. Again, if you want to avoid that, again, also just avoid this section of the video. Again, I'm still going to try to make this a purely EDGIC analysis for this next section. With that, let's get into the ranking itself. Again, we do have 11 players to be ranking here. So let's start off at number 11. The person who I think is the least likely to win the game from an EDGIC perspective is Sophie S. And I think that's a shame because I actually do very much like Sophie S. I actually think probably one of the best moments of the entire season is her response to Jeff about the fruit basket. Yeah, really from an edit perspective, though, her edit has just been nearly non-existent. It really just feels like she's there for expositional content points. Even beyond that, I just simply know nothing about her as a person from the show. She hasn't really gotten a single second of personal content. Even in terms of her relationships in the game, we didn't really see much of that outside of, again, a connection of MC. It really didn't get expanded on to where Sophie S is just someone that, again, just has a very shallow edit here, which is definitely disappointing to see, as, again, I do think there is a fun character in Sophie S, and we do see her in this last episode a bit more, in her trying to play the game a bit more, potentially flipped up on to Christina, which I think could be an interesting future storyline. And based on her last episode, I actually would say that Sophie S felt like she had some setup to potentially be a merge boot, where I could definitely see her losing the battle against Christina. Though I think considering the fact that her edit was so shallow before that, I think it's kind of unlikely she ends up being the merge boot because of that, where typically merge boot ends up having, again, a slightly above average edit. And again, I think it would be a little weird if Sophie S was the merge boot, though again, it's not impossible. Though again, I would be more inclined to think that Sophie S ends up being something closer to, like, again, the second or third boot after the merge, which is a spot that tends to be a little under-edited most of the time, to where, again, I kind of feel like that's the spot I see Sophie falling into. In general, I think that's kind of the take with Sophie S, is that, again, is she winning the game? Very clearly no, with the edit that she's getting. Though, can she still become a fun character from this point on? Yes. I mean, we've seen this multiple times in the new era of these players that get pretty lacking edits early on, but then really pop in the post-merge, of people like Lindsay the Lost Witch, obviously Genevieve. These players, again, have fairly slow starts, though eventually get their time to shine. Again, I could definitely see Sophie S being one of those players, though, again, as a winner, obviously, again, it's not particularly viable, where it feels like she has the shallowest edit of the bunch. So again, she's here number 11. Now number 10, moving on to a player that also is a fairly shallow edit, despite having a bigger edit, and that person is MC. And MC's a player that, again, I also think has a very shallow edit. I feel like I know very little about MC as a person. Yet, despite that, again, she is on the show quite a bit. I mean, she obviously finds the Beware advantage. She obviously has her relationship with Steven. We saw, like, Matt bring her into an alliance, then her building a bond with Sophie S. And again, we see MC on the show. The problem for me is that it feels like a lot of that content is kind of necessary for the story of the season. It feels like a lot of that is there because it kind of has to be. Again, we get content from her in pertaining to her standing on the original Hina because she was in the middle, and they're just obviously going to show that to set up the dynamics of the tribe. Again, her with the Beware advantage, obviously they're always going to show that. She obviously got a lot of content around the journey that she went on. That had to be there. Though I think it's the things that really matter that are just so shallow from MC's edit. Again, despite the fact that we see her connections with, like, Steven and her connection with Sophie S, it doesn't really feel like those connections are really given much time to really be fleshed out. It feels like they're just introduced because they're going to be important, but not really given any gravitas on the show. Beyond that, also, I think the fact that MC's alternate storyline didn't make the edit here is pretty bad also. The fact that, like, Jason's gets introduced from the offset. Yeah, MC, who's also an alternate and also someone that had talked about that on the island, and ends up being someone that doesn't get that on the show, where, again, I think that's particularly damning as well. As, again, I think if she were to win, you would think that they would want to show that and make that part of her storyline. Yeah, again, none of that is making the show, and I think that is very damning there for MC. For me, MC very much feels like kind of like a mid-merge boot, to where while she definitely has some viability to be the merge boot itself, I do feel like she seems like someone that probably gets booted, like kind of in that, like, final 8, final 9 sort of spot. Someone that's, like, propped up as a big player, but not really someone that has much legs edit-wise for the long term. So ultimately, again, I do have it here at number 10. Now, number 9, moving on to a person that I feel like has gotten less screen time than MC, but definitely has gotten more consequential content than MC, though still not good enough. But either way, at number 9, I do have Christina. And Christina is a character that I'm actually surprised at how under-edited Christina is as a whole. Christina felt like someone that, and coming into this season, I was expecting to be one of the biggest characters on the board. I mean, she's someone that got a pretty massive presence on the trailer and all the commercials, and she very much felt like this second coming of Suri, to where, again, I thought there was a lot of potential here for Christina to be one of the stars of the season, and instead, she's kind of just there. And I think that's definitely underwhelming, though. Again, we are at least getting personal content from her. I think that's at least a positive. And we did obviously get her story around her mom. We did get this content of her almost passing out in this last episode, which didn't really lead to anything, which I'll be honest, I think that was probably just more so there because they had no content for the show. But still, I mean, that's something from her. Now, beyond that, I do think Christina's edit, again, is just very shallow. It's one where, again, we don't really know her game connections at this point. She just seems to kind of just be there in Hina, to where, again, she was involved in that initial alliance with Steven and Matt, though really outside that, we didn't really get much expansion on that. And even after the swap, we didn't really get to see much of what she was doing. And now on her swap tribe, we see, again, Sophie S. talk about taking Christina out. And again, that's not great. Now, technically, again, we're going to new era winner trends. Again, there obviously is the trend of the winner being shown to be in some danger early on. I still didn't feel like that was the most flattering look here. And again, the bigger issues, though, Christina's edit is the fact that it's just so under-edited outside that, to where, again, for someone that is seemingly this massive presence, someone that is this very likable presence, that's, again, making these cheers for the tribe, the fact that she has one of the quietest edits of the season, I think is pretty egregious here. And I think it's definitely a sign that she's not going to go on the win. Though, again, in comparison to MC, I do feel like she at least has personal content. To where while I think MC probably has more defined relationships in the game, I think more care was put into how Christina has been portrayed on the show up to this point. And I feel like it's also good enough to where it could potentially shift around at the merge. Now, realistically, I would be more inclined to think that Christina is kind of a late merge boot. Really for multiple factors, both in the fact that I think from an in-game perspective, it feels like Christina is not one of the bigger threats on the board, to where I feel like she's someone that you could take out kind of in the end-game sort of position. But also I think edit-wise, I don't really get early merge boot vibes from her, and I would more so suspect her to be kind of one of these people taken out one of the last episodes before the finale, but someone that doesn't quite make it to the very end. So again, as a whole, her edit is just really shallow, though with, again, a couple sprinkles of personal content that leaves her higher enough to be here number 9. Now, number 8, and now we're moving on to a player that truthfully has had probably one of the worst edits of the season in terms of just how much negativity is surrounding his edit. Yet also someone that is at least on the show and is getting a decent amount of content, and that player is Jawan. And Jawan just is being this weird player on this season that, again, is kind of on the bottom, but doesn't recognize he's on the bottom, and through that gets a lot of negative content from Savannah, talking about how on the bottom he is, and we also have his character moments of him taking Savannah's stuff. And again, there's stuff with Jawan here that hasn't been prominent on the show, yet also not in a positive light. And I think it initially started off as Jawan could potentially be on this Gabler trajectory. Yeah, I think the fact that he hasn't really gotten that much positivity to counteract that negativity is definitely something to detract from his edit here. To where in many ways I do kind of see him more maybe an Andy figure. Even Andy had more positivity in his edit than Jawan did. I do kind of see him coming into the merge, not really being in the in group, and I think eventually probably becoming a casualty of Savannah, where I do think Savannah is clearly being shown as the victor in their rivalry. Yeah, and who knows, maybe that's them trying to subvert our expectations. Yeah, I do feel that just feels where this is all going. I just feel the amount of negativity Jawan has makes it feel fairly unlikely that he's going to be able to get out of that position. The question is, when is he actually taken out? And I do think it actually could range quite a bit here, where I think he could potentially be the merge boot. He could be this expendable person that they take out at the merge. I think he could also be, again, a person that makes it deeper into the game, like Andy, though, eventually gets taken out. I really don't have a great sense on when exactly Jawan would be going home, yet I think he's kind of just viable as a boot, really, from any point now until towards the end, where if he does get to the end, I would assume that he would be a losing finalist in that position. Though I think it's more likely that he doesn't get to the end at all, as again, I do feel in the new era, they've been kind of making this concerted effort to show the finalists a bit more positively, at least not giving them entirely negative edits. And I feel Jawan's edit being, again, not bad from a personal level. Obviously, I think we're meant to like Jawan, but at least negative in the sense that we're seeing him do almost nothing right in the game. I think it's something that is unlikely to get to the very end. So again, I do have Jawan here number 8. Now number 7, and now we're moving on to a player that I had a difficult time assessing here. I actually feel like this is a person that you could argue maybe should be a little bit higher. However, at number 7, I am going to go with Sage. And again, Sage is someone that I think is an interesting player here, where she's someone that does have a pretty sizable edit. She's someone that is one of the better characters of the season up to this point, and is someone that just got her way. She had this massive storyline with Shannon that has her becoming the victor by the end. However, I think the fact that it ends so early is kind of why I do have Sage so low, is because, first up, Sage did not have a great introduction, which to fall is not the end all be all, I guess, nowadays, but still a spot where she's shown instantly as this person on the outs of her original tribe. However, we get the swap where, again, we see her do a lot of good work, both from a strategic standpoint and also see her as like this very reliable narrator, her being backed up by other people's point of views, where I do think her edit has gotten better in these last couple episodes, especially with her, again, just clearly coming off as the victor against Shannon. However, I do think it's still a spot where there's not much legs for Sage's edit beyond this, where actually at this current point, I would say Sage is probably the most likely person to me to be the merge boot, where she just feels like a very expendable person that most people wouldn't be too bothered to get rid of. Beyond that, also, I feel like Sage's edit doesn't really seem to have much legs beyond the Shannon vote off, where really it felt like a lot of that was the backbone behind her edit, where at the point that we're at now, I'm not sure what she really has. Like, obviously, we saw her build a relationship with, like, Steven fairly recently, and we saw her build this bond with Jawan, but overall, I feel like her connections in the game are just very shallow, and it really just felt like all set up to this Shannon elimination, to where I'm not really sure where her edit goes from here. So, again, for all I know, that shifts around at the merge, but again, I think there's just a spot here, Sage, where I'm just unsure of where the edit is necessarily going for her, to where, again, most of her edits seem to just be leading up to an event that has already happened. And because of that, I do feel like it is fairly likely that she would go home soon. Yet, even if that's not the case, I don't know if I necessarily see her going on to win the game, even though, again, she has gotten some pretty strong content here and there. Her coming off as a reliable narrator, her, again, getting her way strategically at this point, at least, where, again, she's not completely dead. Yeah, I do feel like, again, I'm just unsure where her edit's going, so I have it here number 7. Now number 6, and now we're moving on to a player that, again, I think you could argue should be below Sage. I think this is a player that has gotten strong content comparatively to the rest of his tribe, yet it's still, again, not really sufficient enough, but still, that player is Steven. And Steven is, again, the last Hina remaining on the power ranking here, where I do think Steven is the most likely Hina to win the game. That being said, I don't think it's likely that Hina is going to win the game, where Hina, I think, just as a whole comes off as the most shallow tribe in recent history, where despite the fact that, again, we're supposed to be seeing these like two warring factions between Ule and Hina, it really feels like Hina has just gotten really shafted in that battle, to where I just feel like we've gotten very little of Hina as a whole. Again, even on their original tribe, we just got very little of their overall dynamic. Even like the Steven MC bond didn't get introduced until fairly late. And it's weird that we initially get introduced to Steven through his bond with Matt, who is gone by the time of the swap, to where, and it's kind of a weird aspect of Steven's edit, though. With that said, again, Steven, I think, is getting the best content of the Hina tribe, and that's not particularly close. I think he is one of their main narrators. I think he is being shown as a pretty strong player, at least. Now, I will say, I do think for this last episode, it being a spot where he got kind of swap screwed and kind of survived through that. The fact that he didn't really get much content revolving around that, where it felt like he was, again, taking it backstage to Sage, and obviously, like, Jawan had more of the focus by the tail end. It felt like Steven was, again, kind of under-edited for a spot where, again, he should have been a major character, you would think. So I think that's definitely criticism of Steven's edit as well. But all in all, I think Steven's someone that, again, is the most likely to win from Hina, even though I don't think someone from Hina is winning. But I think he's clearly meant to be the biggest player from that tribe. And I think it can be for multiple reasons. I mean, I think it could be that he's the last Hina standing and he's like the final boss of the season. Yeah, I also feel like it's viable that he's like the Kelly Nalbandian of the season, that he's like the big blind side at the climax of this like Hina Ule rivalry. At the same time, I don't expect him to be the merge boot. I feel like it's probably a bit too strong to be booted like right away at the merge, especially when we have other viable candidates. Yeah, I do feel like he's someone that could be booted anytime in between. Not someone I'm particularly looking at as that likely to make it to the end, though not impossible. I do think there's a decent chance that his edit kind of dies in the post-merge, and if that's the case, then yeah, I think he can be like a losing finalist at the end. Yeah, again, as a winner, I just think it's pretty unlikely Hina ends up providing the winner of this season. Yeah, again, if it does, he is the most likely, but again, I still have him here number 6. Now number 5. Now we're moving on to a player that I really don't know what to do with, as this player's edit feels very shallow, yet also we're getting a lot of him at the same time, and more recently we've been getting some personal content, and that player is Alex. And again, Alex is someone that had a very weird start to the season. I do feel like at the beginning of the season, his content felt very circumstantial. It felt like he was just there because he went on the journey and because he was kind of in the middle of things, which, I mean, to be fair, like we literally just had Kyle go on the Win Survivor. And I feel like that was not that different from Kyle's edit to where, again, you never know, but it did not feel great. It felt more in line with like someone like a Danny McRae, or like a Bran Cotton, or like these players that, again, have pretty big premiere episodes because they're fairly important to the premiere, but then after that, really aren't given that much complexity throughout their run. However, Alex's edit is still fairly consistent for the most part. I mean, he is at least, again, present on the show constantly. Obviously not to the extremes that he was in those first few episodes where he was this big swing vote. Yeah, again, we still got this segment of him killing the chicken for whatever reason, which I think is a very weird segment, especially in how he talks about it following that. Yeah, again, it's clearly they're trying to make him likable to us as the audience. I don't know how much they're succeeding with that moment, but again, we are seeing like this personal growth story from him. However, again, it's not particularly likely to lead to a win, where I think he's more likely getting, again, more of this kind of pseudo journey edit, which, to be fair, I feel like a lot of people in the new era kind of get. But again, this, who would have guessed I would have been living out on an island in Fiji and fishing and killing chickens and this sort of thing, that again just doesn't really do much for me. But again, it feels like that's the style of edit that he's getting. And to be fair, I mean, again, Kyle had this sequence last season and went on to win. So again, it's not impossible that someone like Alex would go on the win. Yet I just feel like his edit just feels so shallow and it feels so circumstantial to where, while he has been getting, again, some better content more recently, it doesn't really feel like the content has much long-term depth, especially because, like, in terms of his connections in the game, we really don't see a lot of that. And I feel like that's probably the bigger criticism of his edit, is that in the post-swap phase, we don't really see where he is in the game. And obviously, again, it's difficult to really show his relationships in the game when he didn't really have any from his original tribe that stayed, where literally everyone's gone but Sophie, and Sophie's someone that he didn't have a good relationship with on his original tribe. So again, it's very tough to really set up these dynamics for Alex considering actual trajectory in the game. Yeah, I think if he were to go on to win, you would assume that they would show more of what was going on at the swap tribe, that he would like get more personal segments and him bonding with like Steven and Christina and MC and these other people that are on that tribe. Instead, we kind of get this like sequence of him and Shannon, only for Shannon to be gone. And again, it's like, it does feel fairly shallow by the end, to where, while I do think there are some high points for his edit, it is one where I'm not expecting him to make it to the tail end of the game. That being said, I do think he probably has some longevity. While does have, again, maybe some like Caleb potential of being like instantly looked at as a big threat coming to the merge, I think for the most part, I would kind of expect him to be kind of like a mid-merge boot, if anything, kind of surviving through this initial like Ule-Hina battle. Yeah, again, I would be fairly surprised to see him make it to the tail end. So again, I have him here number 5, not number 4. And at number 4, we're moving on to someone I'm surprised this low. And really, it's a person that has been relatively low in my power ranking for most of the season. And coming into the season, I was expecting this person to be extremely high, and that player is Rizzo. And Rizzo is someone that, straight up, like, coming into the season, I expected to have the biggest edit of the season. Or considering his return for Survivor 50, I was expecting Rizzo to be one of the biggest characters on the board. I was expecting him to be, like, obviously not Russell Hands in terms of the negativity, but at least like getting content similar to that. Again, being like all over the show, this massive presence, this person constantly saying the man, the myth, the legend, R-I-Z-G-O-D, Riz God Baby. And to be fair, he does say that a lot, but I really thought it would be like to an extreme. I really thought he would be in a spot where he would like be the top confessionalist by a lot at this point, but that's not really what we're getting. And I think we're getting a much more subdued edit from Rizzo than what I was expecting, where I was very much expecting him to be just all over the show. And instead, it just feels like he's not even like the second biggest character on the season, which is kind of strange to me. That being said, I do think Rizzo is a likable presence here. Again, we're clearly given some positive content from him. Again, content about his childhood early on. We now get his like fishing sequence here. So I think we're meant to like Rizzo. However, again, it's just another spot where Rizzo's edit just feels kind of shallow, where, and despite the fact that Rizzo seemingly is in this majority, it doesn't really feel like we know much about his actual relationships inside that majority, where despite the fact that we hear talk about how he's close to Savannah, we never actually see much of his relationship with Savannah, which I find very strange. Same thing goes for like Sophie, who's supposedly close to, like, we haven't gotten content between him and Nate since like early on, and it just feels like a spot here where Rizzo hasn't really gotten that much depth from a game perspective, where really I feel like the most game we see from him is the fact that he got pulled into this majority and that he has this beware advantage, which again is very consequential. Now, I will say I do think the content in this last episode around his beware advantage was solid, in the fact that again he came off aware how everyone knows about his idol. Yeah, it's still a spot here where I'm just a bit underwhelmed by Rizzo's edit, where I was kind of expecting him to be a much bigger presence on the season. Instead, he's just kind of this like chill, likable guy that again just feels like your typical Gen Zer. That again, he's fine on the show, yet just someone that I think I expected a bit more from. And again, from an Edgic perspective here, it's a spot where, again, he seems to be in the majority alliance. He is someone that clearly seems to be set up for longevity. Obviously, the fact that he ends up returning for Survivor 50 also would make you think that as well. To where, again, I don't think Rizzo's going anywhere anytime soon. I think the earliest I would see him being booted is, like, in the endgame stretch. Yeah, he's also someone that just isn't really popping on the show as much as what you would expect for someone to go on to win the game, especially if it's a spot where he were to win the game and then come back the following season. So again, Rizzo's Ed is just kind of middling here, but it puts him at number 4. Now, number 3, we're moving on to a person who I think this last episode was pretty bad for this player. Yeah, as a whole, they're kind of in a similar spot to Rizzo, someone that has potential edit-wise, though, again, doesn't seem to be a top contender, and that player is Nate. And Nate's a weird figure here, as I feel like Nate actually had some pretty good content early on. He has to get introduced to his occupation, where he stands in the game, the fact that he's kind of leading this Ule tribe, the fact that he is part of this big alliance, the fact that he's a person bringing people into this big alliance. Again, I feel like early on, his first few episodes were very strong. And obviously in the post-swap phase, he really comes off as this very dominant sort of player. Yet, however, I feel like this last episode was obviously rough. I mean, he obviously swap screwed, yet even then, he gets contradicted, thinking what he's doing is effective, only for it to turn out it's not. And again, I think that's bad. Mind you, again, new era winners typically have a sliver of negativity early on. So again, that's not the worst thing in the world, but it definitely isn't great, especially when it comes off from a full game perspective and being unaware about his game. Yeah, at the same time, it's something that doesn't really seem to be too relevant long-term, considering we're literally merging. But really the bigger issue for Nate's edit, in my mind, is really the fact that his edit is just very shallow if you were to go on to win, especially for a guy in his archetype. Again, this seemingly dominant figure, this person that's running his tribe, getting his way. Again, for that player to just kind of get a middling edit here, like Nate is, again, I think would be very surprising, where again, we're getting so much more perspective on the Ule tribe from Savannah than we are from Nate. Despite the fact that, again, Nate seems to be running the tribe and actually is getting his way more than what Savannah is portrayed to be in the edit. Savannah's getting all this narrational content about what they're doing. Savannah's the one that's getting her perspective shown when going to tribal. It's where I think that's very bad for Nate. The fact that, again, Nate is in this dominant position, yet that's more so being told to us than actually shown to us. To where, again, I think if Nate were to go on the win, you would think that they would, again, primarily focus around how he's running the tribe and his perspective around that. Yeah, instead we're getting someone else's perspective around that, which I think is very bad. That being said, I do think Nate is clearly being shown as a good player. I think he's someone that is being, for the most part, until this last episode, being portrayed as an accurate narrator, to where I do think Nate is someone that clearly is meant to make it deep into the game. Now, again, there's the shot that he's again, this figurehead taken out as this Ule blindside, where, again, I think he would kind of fit in that same mold as a Steven, but for the Ule tribe. Where, again, I think we're clearly meant to be looking at Nate as a very strong player, one that if he were to go out, I think it would be a big move on the resume of the person that did take him out. And I do think, again, is more viable as a winner than Steven, because his tribe is a lot more focused on in the edit, where, again, I think it's very clear the Ule side is going to win this battle between Hina based on how the tribes have been portrayed, to where, again, it definitely gives a massive leg up to Nate here. Though I do find it strange if he were to win in a spot where content you would assume that he would get is being given to other people instead, to where ultimately, again, I think Nate ultimately ends up landing here at number 3. And now number 2, and straight up at this point, from a pure Edgic perspective, this season is a 2-horse race. It is between 2 people, and I don't think it's particularly close. I think it's a massive gap in between the top 2 and the rest. However, I think from a pure Edgic perspective, it is actually close between the top 2. As I think one player has massive highs, but also some lows, while another player is just more consistent. And I did debate between these two here. Yeah, at number 2, I am going to go Savannah. And again, from an Edgic perspective here, I do feel like Savannah ends up having this very bizarre edit. And I think if this was old school Survivor, this would be a cookie cutter winner edit here. It would be one where it feels in line with someone like a Tommy Sheehan, where it really feels like it's an edit that kind of checks off all the boxes, where, again, we get a lot of narrational content from them. We get a lot of content around her occupation, where we got that news reporter segment from her. We get set up to where she stands in the game, her relationships. However, I think there are some downsides that come alongside that. First, the fact that, again, this is the new era in a spot where edits like that aren't typically given the win, even though we've had, again, a tad more normal winner edits more recently. Though still, it's a spot where Savannah, again, checks off a lot of the boxes, but there are some pretty major boxes that she doesn't check off. And I feel like that is really what I'm talking about when I say there's some major downsides with Savannah's edit. And the fact that I do feel like in terms of her connections in the game, I do feel like they come off very shallow. It's where Again, while Ule has obviously been given a lot more complexity than Kina, I do still feel like a lot of the interconnections within the tribe are just not very well developed. I mean, Savannah is someone that, again, seems to be in the middle of everything, has connections with really everybody, yet despite that, I feel like we're not being shown a lot of that. Or really of anybody on this season up to this point. I feel like we got a lot more focus around her relationship with Shannon, someone that's gone by the time of the merge, which maybe that's a spot where like Shannon's elimination will spur Savannah on to get revenge for her. But it's weird that, again, they focus around a relationship that she doesn't even have coming into the merge. Also, the other big relationship she has is Jawan, someone that is, again, a negative relationship, someone that she doesn't like and is clearly going to be targeting and probably get out eventually. But like someone that, again, a weird thing to like focus around that relationship that, again, kind of feels very like Katurah Bruce coded. To where, again, the people that she's actually working with are relationships that feel a bit underdeveloped. Her relationship with Nate, her relationship with Rizzo feels so underdeveloped. To where while we see them together, we don't really get much focus around their actual their actual relationship in the game. Again, we saw some content between her and Sophie B, to where at least there's that. But again, it really just feels like Savannah's edit is just kind of shallow despite like checking off a lot of the boxes. Again, I do think we're missing a lot of like focus around her connections in the game. I do feel like we're also just being shown her as a very like one-dimensional sort of character at points, where outside of her rivalry of Jawan, it really comes off as just very game body. So I do feel like there is like an attempt here to make her like this big villain. Yeah, I don't feel like she's even villainous enough to really be that interesting of a villain. However, all in all, like she is essentially getting closer to the edit that I thought Rizzo would be getting coming into the season, which is a little surprising. Where obviously we know that Savannah is coming back for Survivor 50, and through that, again, yeah, you would think that they would really hype her up on the show. Yeah, I am surprised that she's getting a bigger edit here than Rizzo. Despite her getting a bigger edit here, I feel like it actually comes off a bit more performative here. Like it feels like she's getting this big edit because she's on 50, more so than she's actually that relevant to the story of the season, where straight up Savannah is someone that is not particularly relevant to the events that have gone on up to this point. And I feel like that's the very strange thing about Savannah's edit, which again is more in line with an old school winner edit. And kind of Michelle Fitzgerald coded, the fact that we're getting so much of Savannah's perspective, despite the fact that she's just kind of irrelevant to what's actually going on. Again, it doesn't seem like she's actually getting her way. It feels like Nate is getting more of his way from a game perspective. Yeah, again, we're seeing that from Savannah's perspective. Savannah's getting so much narrational content around her camp, despite the fact that, again, she's not really doing that much. And again, the fact that Savannah has the most confessionals up to this point of the season is just kind of insane, considering she's just kind of there. And I also feel like it's weird, especially considering based on like Exit Press, it seems like she was doing more. Or again, Jason's Exit Press really gave Savannah a lot of the credit for his blind side. The fact that, again, it was Savannah that really tricked him into thinking that he was safe. Yet again, that wasn't on the show. And that's very strange for someone that were to go on to win. To where, again, I think Savannah is someone that definitely has some high highs here. Her edit is one that, again, just feels pretty cookie cutter at many points, but there's also just like major gaps in her edit as well that makes it tough to put her at number one, where while I do think obviously there's a big chance of her winning, there's also a big chance that she's like the final boss of the season, like kind of in this like Jessie sort of mold. To where all in all, I feel like she has just a very strange edit here. But again, I'm going to put her here number 2. And now number 1, the top of my mid-season power ranking for Survivor 49, ends up being Sophie B. And again, from an edit perspective here, Sophie B's edit in comparison to Savannah's feels just more consistent in the fact that Sophie B's edit is one that I don't really have as many holes with her edit. I feel like it's pretty much as you would expect it to be if she were to go on to win the season, especially from the position that she was in. Again, someone that was on the disaster tribe, going to tribal constantly. We got so much focus around her dynamics with almost everybody on her initial tribe, where we see her connections to Jeremiah, we see her connection to Jake, we see her kind of like frosty relation with Alex after the swap. We instantly see her bond with Savannah, and where again, it feels like we're getting a lot of relationship building with Sophie here. Now, I'll say like from a like personal content sort of perspective, I think that's something that Savannah has a leg up on her on, where again, I feel like we at least like know what Savannah's at least former occupation was. Where I feel like from a personal perspective, the only things we know about Sophie is the fact that she's had the same nail technician since high school and hasn't cheated on her boyfriend. Again, it does feel like a lot more of her edit is kind of based around what is happening on the island, which, I mean, to be fair, Kyle kind of had that for a portion of the season and kind of got to know him a bit more towards the end, where it's not the end all be all, but it does feel like definitely something to note here from Sophie. So again, as a whole, I just think her edit's a lot more consistent. It feels like she's getting sufficient content, but not being overexposed in the way that like Savannah is. I think something that really tips it over the edge is this last episode, where I thought we got a great confessional after she got food, talking about how she's like now rejuvenated and is ready to get back into the game, which I feel like feels like the potential start of this like winning trajectory for her, that she could come into the merge running the show, to where ultimately, I think Sophie's here in a spot where her edit feels the cleanest. Again, I feel like there's the least holes in her edit, to where, again, we see her as a very active player. We see where she is in the game. We see all of her connections in the game. I think the real downside here would be a bit of a lack of personal content, though. In comparison to Savannah, again, I think her edit is a lot cleaner. So again, I do have her here at number 1. So there we go. That is the midseason power ranking. As again, by the end of the season, I will be doing the review and player ranking, as you would expect. Hopefully it comes out on time. It's currently planned to, though I also haven't started working on it, so again, we'll see. Beyond that, obviously, we've got Survivor 50 coming up, which will have to be handled in a similar way. I did make a preseason power ranking for it, like, immediately after they flew out. Yeah, outside that, again, I am spoiled in Survivor 50, so again, it will have the mid-season power ranking for that season will be a similar thing to this, though I do intend on going back to being unspoiled from 51 on, though, again, we'll have to see. But beyond that, again, just expect more of the same from the channel. To where I've slowed down to guaranteeing only 1 video a week instead of 2. I do have some pretty big videos coming up. I mean, a lot of this month will really be encompassed by my ranking of every Australian Survivor player, which I wanted to do after Averse the World. So again, that is coming up. I'm currently working on my History of the Survivor 50 casting rumor mill video, which is a pretty big video, though I intend on having that out by the time Survivor 49 ends. And I do have a lot of Survivor 50 related videos that I intend on making after 49 ends to be coming out around when Survivor 50 airs. So again, hopefully I can get to that eventually. But for now, that is the video. Those are my mid-season thoughts on Survivor 49. Thank you for watching.